Welcome to the very first virtual course of the Peer Organization Growth Academy. I am Jessie Davis. My pronouns are she and they. Both sets work perfectly fine for me. And I am a peer specialist that grew up in peer support in Texas. And I'll let Shireen introduce herself as well. And Shireen is going to help kick us off.
Thank you, Jessie. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. We are so excited. My name is 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞, and I've been involved in peer and recovery movements for nearly 30 years now around the country. About 20 years ago, I started a standalone peer-run organization that I'm the CEO of. And so I have cut my teeth in starting, operating, scaling, growing, sustaining a standalone peer-run organization in a different southern state in North Carolina. So I'm hoping that I will share with you my lessons learned throughout all of this process. I will be both a mentor, I'll be facilitating or co-facilitating some of the courses. And for today, I'm just going to be introducing the panelists, and on the back end, will aid in any questions that people may have. And I know I will have some myself. So the way that this is going to go today is we have 3 different groups of Texas-based pioneer and historians in the peer leadership community. And we've divided it by mental health pioneer and historians in the peer leadership community, family partners, and substance use recovery peer pioneers and leaders. And the reason we did that is we know that the history can be really complex, that there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. And we really want to honor and uplift the people that have been involved in making peer support what it is today in Texas. And one of the best ways that we could figure out how to do that is to really highlight each of these groups and the work that has been done in Texas, dividing it out that way. And so we're going to start with our mental health peer support recovery pioneers and historians. And for that, I'm going to kick it over to Stacy, Shannon, and Amy. And what I'm going to ask you to do is introduce yourselves. We are then going to have 20 minutes of presentation from them, and then we're going to follow up with 10 minutes of Q&A. So that being said, Stacy, Shannon, and Amy, take it over. All yours.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. We're glad that you're here. Thank you for coming. We don't have a lot of time. History is definitely something you can get into the sticks and roots on. So I'm gonna just try to do a little bit and then give my fellow peers an opportunity to speak as well. I hope that is good for everybody. Let me know if it's not. But just to tell you a little bit about the history within mental health. And first and foremost, this is just an opportunity for us to share. There is a lot of acronyms all over the state of Texas, so I'm gonna try my best to not worry about so many acronyms and really say the words. All right. But if you wanted to really think about it, we started in the mid-1980s, right? Recognized by the consumer survivor movements. And it began at least in the early 1900s and gained some momentum during the civil rights movement. And in the mid-80s, there was just the awareness, national awareness, that peers had been largely overlooked as a critical component of recovery. And that began the change, right? So in 1986, and I'm just looking at some of my notes, 1986, SAMHSA, help me, Substance Abuse, Mental Health
Services Administration.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Implemented the protection and advocacy for individuals with mental illness, and it was called the PAMI program with affiliates in each state. And so the Mental Health Association of Texas, now Mental Health America, and the PAMI program then operated by Advocacy Incorporated, but Advocacy Incorporated is now the Disability Rights Texas. Yes, I know it's a lot of stuff. Were the first organizations in Texas to actually hire peer advocates. And so the first 2 advocates were Mary, and I don't remember her last name, but Mary was with the Mental Health Association of Texas. It was supported by Stella Mullins, the director of the Mental Health Association of Texas. at the time, and then Diane Cox was with Advocacy Incorporated. Now, Mary in particular was instrumental in getting peer support going. And initially, these advocates worked primarily on state policies. By the late 1980s, the Mental Health Association of Texas began offering peer-led support groups. Now, that was just the 80s. So now let's flip into the 90s. By the early 90s, momentum started building up, and the independent organizations to provide peer support kind of got into its fold. And so initially developed under the Mental Health Association of Texas, there was another organization that kind of came out called Texas Mental Health Consumers. Texas Mental Health Consumers was then developed as an independent peer-run organization, and they were responsible for peer advocacy and peer support. They had their own 501c3, and they were independent. They had an independent board of directors and budget funding by federal mental health block grant funds that were allocated by the state mental health authority. At that time, it was called the Texas Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation, TDMHMR. Now, this is when I actually came to Texas and started seeing all of this stuff take place. Their work was initially focused primarily in Austin. The first executive director of Texas Mental Health Consumers was Cynthia Hopkins. But then after a few years, Cynthia accepted a position at TDMHMR to operate an internal office of peer advocacy. Afterwards, then there is a gentleman by the name of Mike Halligan, and that's the person I know when I first stepped in, was then hired by TMHC's board of directors as the organization's second executive director. Now, during his time as the ED, he received funding from TDMHMR to focus on expanding the programs and creating consumer-operated service providers throughout the state of Texas. During that, he was helping local groups learn to provide support to one another and establish framework, allowing them to become operationally independent, working toward nonprofit status. And by the late 1990s, WRAP, the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, had been developed as a structured way for peers to develop their own recovery plan. Now, TMHC, Texas Mental Health Consumers, hired trainers to go out and take care of building these supports, training everybody to develop their RAPs and training RAP facilitators. I'm a RAP facilitator, and just deployed out to locations all over the state. And so in the early 2000s, there were multiple peer-run organizations and advocacy groups that were springing up all across the state of Texas. I'm one of them. And the state mental health authority began thinking about how to equitably distribute the available funds rather than providing an exclusive contract with Texas Mental Health Consumers. Okay, so here we go. DSHS, Department of State Health Services, stopped funding Texas Mental Health Consumers around 2008, 2009. And then after that, funding for those established COSPs were then continued through providing the funding that was provided by the local mental health authority, and a subcontract with the COSPs then kind of got together. That continued to the present. So now, as of right now, we have 8 COSPs funded through the local mental health authorities, me being included. And then in 2003, the new President's Freedom Commission on Mental Health was established to provide recommendations to transform mental health care. So the commission developed this final report with recovery as an organizing theme. The commission's report included 6 goals with 19 major recommendations. And the first goal was for Americans to understand that mental health is essential to overall health. The second goal was mental health care is consumer and family driven, and has been cited as perhaps the most complex goal proposed. The goal included the recommendations to fully involve consumers and families, peers and families, in orienting the systems toward recovery. Kind of getting out of that medical model and now forming into a recovery model in a sense. It was identifying the values of self-help and peer support, peers and family education programs, and inclusion of peers and families at every level of the system. So peer-run operated service providers and peers representing and promising service delivery models for the system just started transforming. I know that's a lot. I swear we just have a little bit of time, but I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Stacy because she's going to tell you a little bit about the President's New Freedom Commission report.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacy Manser. I am a research scientist at UT Austin. I started my work in this area right about the history that I'm going to share with you all. And one little thing I want to say is if you all are part of this history, please put all that in the chat. We're trying to compile a document that includes everything that you all know. We realized through this process, there's so much that we didn't know and so much that people have to share. So if y'all can think of things, please put it in the chat. So kind of building on what Shannon said, after the release of the President's New Freedom Commission, SAMHSA was like, hey, we're going to release a funding opportunity to the states. And it was called the Mental Health Transformation State Incentive Grant. So at that time, Dave Wanzer was the Associate Commissioner for Behavioral Health at Department of State Health Services. So he asked, I'm sure, me, I worked at the state at that time, Cindy Hopkins, you've heard her name before, and Linda Logan. We wrote the grant application for the mental health transformation, Anna, Texas. So one of the requirements of the grant was establishing an advisory committee of state agencies who provided mental health services, including representatives from the governor's office. At the same time, they had 3 people with lived experience or were family members on the panel. So that was Mike Halligan, Stephanie Bryan, and Maurice Dutton. So what they did, this whole advisory committee guided grant activities. And at the same time, Sam Shore at the state, Wendy Latham, who's still working at the state in Noah Abdenauer's group, to guide and provide input in all the recovery and peer-related activities within the grant. One thing I'm going to add at this point in time is just, we can't forget the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health. Throughout all of these processes of the grant and supporting activities, they were extremely involved, and they've supported and continue to support the recovery peers and families through a lot of initiatives, such as the Hogg Mental Health Policy Fellows, which many of you work with directly. And they also hired at that time, Tammy Hines and Stephanie Bryan to kind of help support all of these other activities going on. So we applied for the grant and we got it, and it was fantastic. And during that process, one of the things that Dave Wanzer asked and what he had hoped to accomplish through that grant, and got to think about that, that was back in 2005, before there was all of this different kinds of technology. But one of the questions that he had and one of his hopes that would come from the grant was that why can't we have 25,000 people with lived experience or peers in Texas connected through a listserv, that they're driving change, that they're all on this listserv, they're really giving us information that we should be using to drive change in the state. At that time, there was a ton of peer work going on, but it wasn't as consolidated and coordinated. So at the same time, only a handful of states at that time had established formally recognized. So when I say that, I mean like the state that they were in had formally recognized peer training and certification programs. So through the MHT, the state released an RFP to fund a training and technical assistance center to support peer training and certification and recovery-oriented service recovery-oriented services throughout the state. So there wasn't at that point in time, there wasn't a statewide mental health peer-run organization to apply for those funds. So MHAT, Mental Health America Texas, and NAMI applied together for those funds. They submitted that application. And then from that joint effort, via HOPE, which many of you all have heard of and are familiar with, they were formed and they began initiatives to support those grant activities and really to look at peer specialists in Texas. Also important to remember that this is not just the first peer specialist training and certification. DBSA had a training. Other organizations were also offering peer support training. So as they developed that very first training based on the Appalachian model out of Georgia with feedback from Recovery Innovation and also DBSA, the inaugural peer specialist trainings were held in March and June of 2010. So 57 peers were trained in those first two trainings, and 48 of them passed the certification exam. And then they also allowed the grandfathering in of peers who had completed other trainings. So really, back in 2010, there were about probably 75 mental health peer specialists in the field. It's continued to grow. So I'm going to pass it on back to Shannon.
Are you going to go, Shannon? Keep going?
Yo, you can go ahead and go. I was having a problem unmuting myself.
Okay, I can go. And I'll finish typing what I was about to type. So, I love what we've kind of like talked about at this point and where we're at in kind of like the thinking of our history. And my name is Amy Pierce, and I'm a mental health peer specialist, and I've worked as a peer specialist since the early 2000s. I was trained in one of those first trainings from Texas Mental Health Consumers, as well as the first of Via Hope. My background stems from, I started the first peer support program in the state hospital system. I've worked in the local community services, as well as provided technical assistance and trained across the US and national. But when I think about like the movement here in the state of Texas, it's always intriguing to me about how the different things have come together, right? And there's all these different like roots of like this tree that we've created, and so many pieces and parts like overlap. And one of the things that I was going to talk about a little bit was around Shannon, if you're okay, I'll speak a little bit about the seclusion restraint.
Yeah, go right ahead.
And then I'll kind of go into TC. Does that work?
Yep.
So for me, when I was at I was hospitalized almost a year at a state hospital, at Terrell State Hospital, and when I then went back and started working there. And when I was working there, I got pulled into a seclusion restraint reduction initiative because that was something that was going on statewide. This was like 2002, 2003. And they started seeing and really looking at and speaking about the value of lived experience. And with this NASPID report, which I'll attach here in just a second, it provided this space that I don't know had been in the state hospital system prior to that, of really looking at and creating like a peer support program within the state hospital system to really look at advocating and changing from within and supporting persons who were hospitalized at the hospital. And so in the early 2000s, with this initiative, we actually at Terrell State began the first peer support program in the state hospital system. And from that, we saw this outflow of, I think it was like Ash, Sash, North Texas, it kind of just kept flowing, but it all stemmed from, my point being, this initiative around seclusion restraint reduction, which I don't know how often we think about, like so often where this work has come from. And when I think and look at like the movement in itself, it's like, it's from these civil rights places. Like we talked about the PMA Council, we've talked about these other places. And so often here in Texas, we've got these different pockets that have been going on in different like start and stops. Like we talked about Texas Mental Health Consumers, like they went and they were here for a short period of time and then it went away. And I'm going to ask some of y'all who I know are on here who know the dates that I didn't find the date or I didn't write it down. But back starting in like 2005, 2006, someone help me here, Anna, Janet, a group of people, and a group was brought together through Via Hope, and I think Shannon's going to talk about that too. So I don't want to jump into this. Do you want to go there first, and then I'll jump back into TCE, Shannon, because it kind of like goes off of that.
On which part, Amy?
Around the group coming together to talk about recovery in that meeting in Austin.
The 2019?
Mhm.
Okay. So, and let me know if I'm in the right spot. In 2019 is when the state basically said, well, there was a legislative push to say, you know what, we need to make sure that a lot of our peers, our stakeholders get together and start formalizing peer services. And so they were thinking about making it part of a Medicaid billing thing. So I remember Noah was on there. I was on there. Anna, I know she's on this call too. And there were a lot of stakeholders from the mental health peer supports, the substance use peer supports, some doctors, some technicians. There was just a lot of people on this call. At this meeting to start thinking about the idea of how to develop Medicaid billing for peer support and what that looks like. At the end of the day is what Stacy was talking about, where we ended up having those people able to start in 2020. I think it was January 2020 to be able to now have that certification as a peer specialist, mental health peer specialist, certified mental health peer specialist, and a certified recovery support peer specialist. So that was, to me, it was a really great opportunity, but it was also a training opportunity, not only for those who were going through it, but for me, because now it makes me look into how to supervise and to make sure that supervision for mental health peer supports or the peer supports in general are of quality, and being able to kind of make that movement happen. So Amy, I'm gonna pass it back off to you because I want you to make sure you have enough time to talk.
Sounds great. So I still can't type and talk at the same time. Here, let me hit that. So I did attach the seclusion restraint, the NASHBID report, which is where you can really see some of the language that brought in peer support through the state hospital system. And Stacy was talking about like the creation of Via Hope and the creation of this funding and the block grant funding. And I want to say it was like 2005, 2006. And like I said, I lost my sticky note where I had it, where a group of persons actually came to Austin and there was a conference. And this conference brought together people really talking about recovery-based initiatives and around peer services. And there was this offshoot from that conference of individuals, and I wasn't a part of that because I was actually training up in Alaska, so I missed it. So everything I'm saying is like hearsay on this part. Got together and really started talking with Dean Fisher, who was with the National Empowerment Center, about creating a basically a peer network in the state of Texas, right? A peer advocacy network. And from that group of people who are Anna, Janet, you'll hear people such as, I hate when I go blank, Lena, and I'm going to mess up on all the people. I think Bill Gilstrap was there.
Tammy was there.
Tammy, Michelle
Actually,
Bibby.
Nami was there. Robin Payson was there.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna, because there's that. So they came together in this beautiful space and started talking about kind of like the what ifs. And with that, there started this push around creating this peer network. And what became known as TCE, Texas Catalyst for Empowerment, really had support from, like Anna was saying, NAMI, there was funding from Via Hope from the state, from Hog Foundation support, to create this network of persons with lived experience, peer specialists coming together, not just peer specialists, but to really advocate on behalf of persons who had mental health challenges in the state of Texas. And it was a working board who, I don't even know how to explain the amount of work that they put into starting to try to create things, create a symposium. I added on there the Texas Catalyst for Empowerment. That was the first like thing that came out of it, from a gathering of people from across the state, basically stating, if you look at it, you can see like some really incredible statements about what we wanted to see. And TCE, just in its history, and I think we've seen that throughout the state, it had this ebb and flow, and you had persons who were working different jobs, they were coming together, they had this passion all together, and it just had a challenge finding its direction and its footing of really moving forward and staying going. And I think there's a lot of things that could be said around TCE. Yeah, thank you. About what worked and what didn't. What I saw work was that it really crafted and created this space for leaders to start being developed and start really coming out and like shining. But what didn't work is there wasn't anything that kept it moving and kept it going forward. It really was on the backs of a few people. And over a number of years, it eventually just kind of like disbanded. And which has led us kind of where we're on today with Shannon. I'm gonna throw this back to Shannon, who a group of people once again have come together in an attempt to bring forth that peer advocacy network here in the state of Texas.
Thank you, Amy. And we got about 2 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and just make this way quick. Now, currently, what's happening is that Austin Mental Health Community, in partnership with Prosumers International, have received a SAMHSA grant to be able to gather all of us together. We've done a lot within the SAMHSA grant, but one of the things we want to do is to make sure that especially peer-run organizations, peer-operated service programs, are able to stay connected with each other. So there is an organization called TPN, the Peer Network, who is trying to do that together right now. And I'm gonna drop that into the chat in a little bit. But with the peer network, they have the opportunities to be able to be there for you at the state level and also let you know what's going on at the state level. Stay connected. We try to meet, twice a year, peer mental health peers around the state of Texas, just so we can come together and be able to network and feed off of each other and support each other. The last thing that I wanted to just stop in and say is that, as trailblazers, and there's a lot of trailblazers on this call as well, but even as a trailblazer, what I need you all to do is to stay connected with each other. Stay connected. Stay connected for state initiatives. Stay connected for communication back and forth. Partner with each other. Sometimes that money is very few and far between, and so we are, the earlier peers, we tend to want to argue and fight against each other with what little money we have. But start learning how to diversify your income when you are thinking about, getting out there and doing what you need to do. Connect with people that have experience that you need. The value of peer support is so viable in this arena. So we just want to make sure that it continues. Last, first and foremost, the message of hope has to stay primary piece of recovery. Okay. Just make sure that we just get all of that together. So Stacy, Amy, any last minutes? Last seconds?
We spewed a lot of things at you, and I just want to acknowledge that in the sense of that when we think about it, like having been doing this work for, I guess now, like almost 23 years for me, I think about like each of you who are on this space and in this space. Some of you I've known for years, some of you I've not yet to meet, but it's because of each of you that things keep moving forward and things keep evolving and things keep changing, and that opportunities can open up. And it really is because of you, your willingness to take on this learning collaborative and like work and create these spaces of peer-run organizations. There's nothing better. So I just thank y'all for showing up, and anything that we can do to support you along the way in whatever way we might be able to do that, we're here.
Anything else you want to add, Stacy?
I just put a note in the chat. I don't want to take up the time, but I think what we've learned from all this is there's so much that so many people have, and it's not all in one place. And that we don't want to forget history as we, as the future is built, and as we keep connecting new peers and building peer leaders and peer organizations.
Shannon and Amy and Stacy, thank you so much. We're going to open it up for Q&A. I do want to remind folks that you are invited back on Monday for a dialogue with our panelists, but also with folks that may be in the audience right now that also have strong history and connection to these movements. So please feel free to join us again on Monday, where it will be unscripted. There will be no presentations. It really will be more opportunity to be able to come together in dialogue. So I just wanted to share that. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. You can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself. While you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to kick us off. And so all three of you have talked about history and the history being important. And there are so many people that have been a part of the movement in Texas. We have this new cohort that's coming together in end of 2023, beginning of 2024. Why do you think the history is relevant to the leaders that are emerging or current leaders right now? And is there anything in particular that you want or hope that they take away from the history and lessons learned to be able to keep that flame and that torch going as Texas evolves with peer support?
I think for me, probably when I think about that, is that learn from the things that haven't worked, learn from, those lessons that we've learned, but also that, when I look at things over the last 23 years, and I can get in the middle of the moment of right here and today and get really frustrated. I'm like, why are we still doing that? But when we actually start looking back, like, to see how far we've actually come. And I think for me, that has been a really important thing just in the last couple of days of us, or weeks of us, kind of like exploring this, because sometimes it can get really easy to get frustrated and get really easy when you see the same things happening over and over and over. And so having that knowledge of history and kind of learning from it and looking back at like where we actually were and where we actually are, I think is really important. But also to not forget that this work came from that civil rights movement piece, right? In that place, in that advocacy place. And I think as we really look at the professionalization of this work, it's important that we don't lose that, right? And we don't lose that in creating new leaders and new advocates to go in and say things at the state capitol. I guess that for me, when you asked that question, those were the things that kind of stood out. That was like,
I feel like we have, or we're at risk of losing that history of the fact that the peer and recovery movements were rooted in social justice, civil rights. I mean, it really was an anti-oppression movement right from the beginning that led to what we now know as peer support. Do you think that is being lost, or we're at risk of it being lost?
I think we personally are. Personally, I think that we are. That's why it was really important of bringing in like that Nashville report for me, because like the peer support movement from the state hospital came out of that, like looking at rights, like these rights issues, right? But it's so much bigger than that. And I think we tend to go away from it. And as we lose some of those past historians, as people pass away, as we lose this knowledge and we lose this expertise, it just seems like it gets thinner and thinner, or watered down even more, if that makes sense. And I worry about that.
Shannon, you're shaking your head a lot. Is there anything specifically that you want to add?
I'm sitting here listening to Amy, and I'm just saying, preach, sister, just preach. It's the same exact thing that I'm thinking of. Like it's really I have been in Austin for a little over 20 years, have been doing this for a little over 20 years. And I know that there are some trailblazers that are on this call. Amy was one of the first people I met. Went to go visit her at the hospital when she was getting the Oasis Center
No
started.
clue what I was doing.
But it was beautiful. and those amazing things is like, I tend to sit back and it's almost like my mom is getting of age and she makes the best dressing in the world, but she will not tell us and will not show us how to make this dressing. And so at the end of the day, if I don't get up at 5 o'clock in the morning with her and at least write it down like little bits at a time, I'm never going to know about how to make this amazing dressing. And that watered down piece that Amy was talking about is exactly what it is. It's not going to be as flavorful, as vibrant, as amazing, as strong, as, you know, the whole gambit, as the history, knowing all of the history that you can. In this 20 minutes, we just kind of spitted out a whole bunch of stuff. But if there is a way, and this is why I loved this panel so much, because if there is a way that now we can formulate it, put it together, have a nice little reel, a video or something to talk about all of these amazing people, because as we are getting to different areas of our peer sport, it's fading. It's fading because right now the understanding is I just need to keep my job. History, what? I just need to make sure I pay my bills. What, you know? So something to along the lines is we're able to really capture this information and have it available and accessible, so that people don't have to do the digging, you know, make it something that's quick. But yeah, it is definitely getting watered down and forgotten. I don't know, y'all see my background. I do a lot of history on my family, and I've gone all the way back to our heritage and just the awe of knowing that, the awe of knowing where I came from. It humbles me.
That's right, Shannon. And Anna added in the chat, if we don't remember the struggle, we don't value the accomplishments, and it's so much easier to become co-opted and forget that this was revolutionary. It still is revolutionary. We are still not in every room, let alone leading the charge for reform efforts and anti-oppression and alternatives to forced treatment. And, you know, Amy, you talked about segregation and restraint and seclusion. Those things exist and are still a very prevalent way that we approach people experiencing emotional distress. So we have a lot of work to do. And I just want to personally thank you all for being in that fight, for pushing, for being a part of a larger national movement with the work that you've done in Texas. And then, of course, gifting us today with your wisdom and your time. And Shannon, you're probably the third or fourth person that said, we need to archive this. We need to come up with some sort of organized way to remember the history and keep it present. And I think, Amy, you even said when I was putting this together, there are pieces that I learned about our history that I didn't know. And you really appreciated the opportunity to go back and celebrate all the accomplishments and some of the amazing human beings that came before us. So with that being said, I thank all three of you very much. As I said, we can't dig into everything today. There's a lot of details. We can't cover it all, but please join us back on Monday. And if you have specific questions for this section of our panel, please feel free to bring them on Monday and have that dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Shireen.
Okay, so our recovery champions, peer leaders in the family partner space. We have three amazing human beings with us today, Molly, Nydia, and Felicia. If the three of you would be willing to introduce yourselves, that would be great. And then go ahead and start your panel. So Molly, Nydia, and Felicia. Welcome. Thank you.
Hello. I think they got to ping us. I think they got to. There you go. Hello. Good morning, everybody. I think they had us in reverse. They were showing the lovely recovery support folks, and I thought that we were going next. So we're okay. We're flexible. We are, you know, we're the can-do attitude, so we'll just roll with it. But good morning, my name is Felicia Mason Edwards. I am the workforce manager in the Peer and Recovery Support Unit. We are so glad you're here. I am just here just gonna kick it off. One, thank you guys for participating. And I know what was already mentioned, that, this is an honor and just to be a privilege just to talk to you all just about the history of family support. But one thing I do want you all to think about is even bigger than that, because we're talking today about specific kind of peer movements. But if you know me, you know that I always equate things into different things. So I always like to think about the concept of one band, one sound, right? And so as peers, thinking about like we are all one band, but we're different parts in that band. So we may, some of us may play the flute, some of us may be the drums, some of us may be the clarinet or whatever, because our lived experience is very different. But as peers, we are still one band and we are stronger together as one band. But we also need to have the one sound, because sometimes I think it was alluded to earlier, is sometimes that we can get off tune, off key. And when we're in the community, we sound bad and we look bad. And so we want to make sure that we are partnering together, as was also mentioned, to work smarter, not harder, but partner better. And then as peers partnering together, because we can make that one sound and have a huge effect. So today we're here to talk about the family voice and the family movement of that sound. And so the great thing about that is families have been a part of everybody's life since the existence. And so we believe that families have had a movement since the existence of time. It's just, we'll talk a little bit about the peer space and how that works. So now I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Molly Lopez.
Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Lopez. I am a researcher at the University of Texas at Austin at TIMH. And I think because I am probably the oldest one on this panel, I'm going to talk a little bit about the really early history. And one of the things I want to recognize, because one, because it's true, but also because I know it's a part of history in general, is that we can't see all the parts of it, right? No one person or even a group of people may see all pieces of it. So I want to sort of recognize that what I have to share comes mostly from the state kind of perspective about how, as a state agency, some of this was supported. And I want to point out that positionality, because I know that that leaves out some of the grassroots efforts that were absolutely going on at the same time, and I just have less information about that. So one of the things that's a little bit unique, I think, about the story of the family movement is that in Texas, around some of the same times we've been talking about, there really was no children's services. Services may have been happening, but there wasn't really an infrastructure in place for specific groups to provide policies or procedures around children's mental health. There was no leadership. It was more that some of the community mental health organizations were providing services to children and families, but there wasn't much structure. So really in the early, in the 80s, mid to late 80s, there became a real focus on how do we develop a children's mental health service system? And really families and our advocates were the beginning of that movement. A recognition that we needed to be able to really focus in and provide supports for how to serve children and families, because it was not the same thing as serving adults with mental health challenges. And a lot of this work really grew nationally as a part of what was called the Child and Adolescent Social Service Program at the time, or CAS, which later became the System of Care movement in the state. And that System of Care movement, or CAS movement, really, really valued the role of families in driving service systems changes. And so in Texas, it was really in the late 80s and early 90s where that movement began to be a part of how we thought about children's services and how children's services should be developed. So some of the things that happened in that early period was there were hosted some multi-agency parent advocate expert forums. So bringing together families and parents who had involvement in the different systems that children and adolescents may be involved in. So the juvenile justice system, the education system, the mental health system, the child welfare system. How do we bring all of those experts together to talk about how our systems should operate? What do we need to put in place for children and families? Similarly, the state began to advocate for family involvement at the local level. So our community mental health centers were asked to establish some procedures for how do they involve families in planning and development. One of the interesting things that that happened is we started to have these families as allies conferences. So regional conferences bringing together families with multi-agency funding. So funding and support from the mental health system, funding and support from the education system, and sort of recognizing across all of these systems in which our children and adolescents reside, in which our families engage with, we should all be making changes to align with what families really need and want. And so really a lot of this early work was around trying to build family voice and trying to build systems which were responsive to what families were really needing at that time. One of the things the state did early in the 90s was to fund the Texas NAMI organization to try and build some regional family voice in the state, developing and supporting some regional grassroots organizations. And over time that that shifted and changed towards some, as we mentioned in the peer movement in general, some funded contracts which went to our Texas Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health, which at the time was led by Patty Jur. And there was a lot of work across the state by that organization, again, in building family voice and building a coalition of families and in using that voice to change the service system. The state also funded the Mental Health America of Texas to develop a statewide family involvement plan in the early 90s. Really wanting, as a part of that, that was kind of the first discussions really about what parent support and parent training might look like. Most of this work was really focused on our system of care communities, our CAS communities. So it was kind of bits and pieces. It was not, system-wide at all, but it was the beginnings of development of the idea that we really need to have our families supported by other families within service systems. In the early 2000s was when the Mental Health and Return Department at the time hired their first family leader, who was Sharon Sheldon. And she was really responsible with both supporting family voice and those early developments of the idea of family peers. Again, most of this work was happening in pockets mostly in grant-funded projects. We had a few different system of care grants, so federally funded grants that were requiring that family leadership and family peer support. And we also had some state-funded grants, which was called the Texas Integrated Funding Initiative, or TIFI, which also supported the beginnings of those family peer projects. So that's some of the really early work kind of establishing, and I'm going to pass it over to Nydia, who's going to talk about kind of the boom from that point.
Hi, thank you, Molly. I'm sorry, I'm such a nerdy little geek when it comes to history. I just love the way, we think things happen just from our experience, right, in these little pockets. But what I love seeing is just kind of, how they all string together to create where we are now. Anyway, my name is Nydia Heston. I'm a certified family partner, have been certified since, well, that's another story. But anyway, certified family partner. I'm also a licensed master social worker. I am currently the family engagement specialist for Texas System of Care. So picking up where Molly left off, I'm over here kind of reminiscing on all the different things. I came into the work of family partner via the IDD world. I have a younger sibling who I am now the guardian of. I was 12 years older than him when he first, when we first realized as a family that he needed some support in that area. So prior to my son being born, which in the family partner world we call the gift of our job, I had already had extensive experience in that field. So I came into the world of family voice and peer support through IDD. And I will just also say yesterday, I heard this new way of saying IDD. They called it intellectual and developmental distinction. So I'm going to try to incorporate that whenever I talk about that. So I came to the peer world or peer movement in 2007 when I was hired at Integral Care as a certified family partner. My son at the time had been recently diagnosed with autism. He was nonverbal at the time, and so that's where I formally came into peer support, but I'd been doing it for several years prior to that, just because of my own son's diagnosis. And believe it or not, I was just doing the math, and as of today, I've been involved in helping families find their voice, advocate for their children for about 33 years, if you can believe that. So I've been doing that a long time, and I think what really speaks to me is what Felicia kind of mentioned, is that for the way, through my lens, peer support, the formal family partner peer support, was really born out of this need for parents, both in the IDD world and mental health. When we talk about NAMI, right, in the early 70s, it was parents coming together who had what we now call transitional age youth, who were like, we really need support, and how and where do we find that support, and then collectively have a voice. So I feel like that has just really moved to where we are now, to the peer support. So in 2007, there, as you've kind of heard, there really wasn't a formal certification process. I think family partners across the state were kind of meeting. We were talking about Patty Durr, and Michael Hasty also came up, Sharon Sheldon, someone else that Molly mentioned. I remember hearing these names, but and I remember hearing about the Federation, but didn't really know how to get together with those groups. So there's also been some history given already about Via Hope and how that was born out of Mental Health America, the partnership between Mental Health America and NAMI, Texas at the time. I actually have a visual of a flyer that has the both logos of NAMI, Texas and Mental Health America, asking family partners to come to this meeting in the spring of 2011 to talk about a family partner curriculum. So in 2010 is when we started. I was part of that group as well. I think, I don't remember. I thought I saw Stormy on here. I don't remember. I feel like Stormy might have been there as well. I don't quite remember. It was a while ago. It was a while ago. And we talked about ethics, we talked about values, we talked about what the curriculum should look like, what it should be, how long it should be. And it was just really great to feel the camaraderie around all the family partners across Texas. So that curriculum was stamped and approved in the first class I was held, I believe, the fall of 2011. I was denied entry into that first class, but I was lucky enough to go into the second class, spring of 2012. And that's when I became a certified family partner. So I like to describe or let people know about this part of the history, because as a movement, and I'm going to forget this one part as well, but I believe it was in about 2005 when the legislator said, okay, we need peer support in the form of family peer support to be part of the state behavioral health system. So in 2005, family partners were kind of mandated, unfunded, and still kind of are, but we won't go there, to be part of that support piece for families. So in 2007 is when I was hired. I believe I was a second family partner for my local mental health agency, but it wasn't until 2011 that we actually had a certification curriculum. So that means that a lot of us practiced this work based on our personal experience and the fact that we really were helping families help find their voices for their youth. Amy talked a little bit about restraint and seclusion, and believe it or not, that is still something that families are fighting for desperately, mostly in public schools right now. So it is still, I feel, a civil rights movement. And what just has grown out of that is, again, this formal peer support. Let's see, I'm looking at my notes here. So between, like, again, I said, we talked about Via Hope. That's kind of where the peer training and support landed. I was, in 2018, came on as I don't know, it was maybe 4th or 5th family partner coordinator. We did some updates to the curriculum. There was an advisory committee of family partners at Via Hope that helped to guide us into what it was that we wanted family partner support and workforce support technical assistance to look like. Continue to develop endorsements for family partner. There was a juvenile justice endorsement, there's a special education endorsement, and then there's also a wraparound endorsement that it's available for family partners through CTI, which Felicia will talk about in a little bit. I'll also mention during this time, the YES waiver was piloted and then became available across the state in 2015. That also included, we talked about system of care a little bit, Molly talked about that. So also simultaneously during this time, the state really started to recognize the value, and I'll say the necessity of having youth and family voice in systems, not only in the systems that they're interacting with, but also at state and policy levels. So we continue through system of care. That is something that we certainly continue to work through or to work towards. I think that's what I've got for now. Molly or Felicia, is there anything that I should add for that? Let me just add really.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, just in that 2010 time, that was that 2005, 2010 was really when the state required that each local mental health authority had to have at least a minimum of one family partner employed within the organization. And then they also put a performance measure around it to ensure that there was a family partner that was actually hired within that organization. So that was something that was not heard of before, because that wasn't technically on the peer side of the house, to where it was actually in the actual performance contract, again, only for local mental health authorities. So that was something new and highlighted that had never been done before.
Yes, thank you. I'm seeing a little bit in the chat. Let me just go over really quickly for some people who may not be aware what's the eligibility for family partners in Texas. You must be 18 years old and have either a GED or a high school diploma. This part is super important. The person must have at least 1 year of experience successfully navigating a child serving system. And that can look like anything like mental health, juvenile justice, Social Security. I'm in the throes of that right now with my own kiddo, special education system. I mean, there's just so much, CRCGs, system of care. I mean, there's just so much that can include that. A lot of times if we're talking to a potential family partner, they say, what does successful mean? It means that you keep doing it, right? And that you have hope and you continue looking for supports for your youth and your family. Also very important that they can articulate their lived experience to other families for the purpose of educating, role modeling, and providing hope related to what's really important, the recovery process. Family partners are not here to be the end all be all. We're not here to be the heroes of the family. We're not here for our own egos, or hopefully we shouldn't be. We're really here, and that's why I mentioned that at the very beginning. When I was doing this work without a curriculum, I was really focused on the family having a voice and knowing what they wanted to do and what was helpful to them going forward as they navigated a system. They can speak to their lived experience and accomplishments that concern mental health issues in addition to normal parenting issues. And this is kind of iffy. They can meet the requirements for Medicaid background check. That one we can talk about if we want to, but yeah.
And most importantly, you have to be a parent of a child, or you have to be the legal authorized representative. And that's what people often forget, is that they'll say, oh, well, I help raise my brother, or I help raise my sister. And it's like, well, are you the legal authorized representative? And for a lot of people, they don't, unfortunately, get the legal documentation. It's just, okay, mom is telling you to help with this process because you know a lot about this process. And so I think that's where it stumps a lot of people. And we do get a lot of questions about that particular bullet within the actual requirement as well.
Thanks, Felicia. I was going to mention that one with a little story. We recently came from a Federation of Families conference in Chicago, and this was one of the questions in our group that someone asked: does it really have to be a parent or a legal authorized representative? I said, let me give you an example. As I mentioned earlier, I was 12 years older than my brother and have seen all the things around IDD and what we need to do with that. So yes, I'm a champion for my brother. During COVID, I had to become his legal guardian. Let me tell you what, it is. I have my own child, obviously, but it is a completely different world emotionally, financially, a time commitment to actually be the guardian of someone. I was just trying to take care of some things yesterday, and again, it was painfully clear because of systems that being someone's guardian, legal authorized representative is different than helping someone, along the way. So that is, to me, the most important thing. And we often get this, people want to be a family partner and they have great lived experience in helping a family member. But once you are that guardian, that LAR, it's just hits differently. And that's a support that we want to continue to offer to parents. Okay, I think that's it for me.
All right. Felicia and Molly, do you have any parting words of wisdom before we get into Q&A?
So the only thing I would say is that, just as a FYI, our unit, since our peer unit started in 2019, the actual position of the family partner moved to the peer unit when I got hired in 2020. So that was definitely new, because we had always been in the children's mental health section. And so we also now are under the Texas Certification Board, like all other peers. And then some other things, just kind of as we move to the future, our goal really is for the family movement is to not just provide family services within the behavioral health system, but outside of the system. So most of you, I do know on this call, most of you have probably heard me say it. I want family peers in Starbucks and Target and Walmart and wherever in the community, because that's where life happens. And so our goal really is, again, to amplify the family voice, to make sure that if we really have the dream team, family peers are a part of that dream team, mental health peers are a part of that dream team, recovery support peers are part of that dream team, youth peers are a part of that dream team, and reentry peers are a part of that dream team. That is the dream team that we want to happen. We don't want to be siloed where, oh, well, we only provide this particular service, because families don't come in a box. They come as a unit. And so that's the one thing that I will say about, again, having the one band, one sound. We are one team with our specialties, with lived experience. Now we got to act like we are one band and have one sound.
Mm-hmm. So kind of building off of that, why do you think it took so long for family partners, family navigators, parent partners is called something different in different states. But why do you think it took so long to recognize that family partners are part of a peer support community? At least in Texas, what do you think? Why do you think that division occurred?
Well, I think there's multiple things because again, kids are under the age of 18, so they're housed in a different unit, right? Here, kids also can't vote, and so and then you're also talking about money. So I think there's layers about it. But one thing I can say is that the family partner movement has been here for a long time. It just hasn't gotten the amplified visibility as everybody else. But we have been here just as long as peers. And I say families have been here longer than peers because we're all families and everybody's been navigating different things and different systems. It just wasn't a systematic thing, right? And so I think that's why I think we're still small because of kind of the way that we contract. So our numbers are smaller in the state of Texas. And I think also helping people to remind us is like, you know, I always say we're the ones that create the barriers because we're still the people within the system. Like regardless of whatever system you're in, even if you're a peer-run organization, that's just a different system in the community, right? Which is a great system to be in the community. But we can also help eliminate those barriers, which again, it comes with partnering. I think Shannon alluded to it earlier, partnering together, working smarter, not harder, but partnering better than we have been and not bickering about whose lived experience is better. Because nobody's lived experience is better because it's your lived experience. If you walked in your shoes and nobody can take that away from you. And I tell everybody, we have a PhD in our lived experience. And so the issue is, can we be collective in the voices that we are in when we are in the public and still celebrate each other's, lived experience? So I'm a family peer because my daughter gave me the gift of my job on April Fool's at 2 months early, 3 pounds, 1.8 ounces. But I'm also going to celebrate the mental health peers. And I'm also going to celebrate the reentry peers every time I speak. And I think we have to do that collectively so we can remind people that there is a team approach to this. And we just have to get better with having the team members working in spaces across our state.
All right, from our audience, any questions? You can unmute yourself, raise your hand, put it in the Q&A. You know, if you don't ask, I'm going to ask.
I just wanted to add to Felicia right quick, and this is kind of one of those, we need to continue to stake our flags as far as a family partner, kind of what we said earlier. We were recognized by the legislature and mandated, unfunded and mandated in 2005. So we've been around a long time, and we all have either a parent or someone in our lives that has been that for us. So parents have always been here championing, what they thought was best for their kids. And of course, this has evolved, right? Over time, we know that what some of our parents or, family members from before did is different. And, we've grown and we've learned. But that is definitely something that family partners continue to do. We continue to mentor other families. I remember working with a family who didn't know they could request medical records. I mean, who doesn't know that anymore? Or maybe they didn't feel like they had the voice to do that. So we continue to do that. And like it has been said earlier, we really do want to partner with what I call the adult mental health peers. I would, to continue to support our youth as they grow up and move into different spaces as well.
So this is a little bit of a provocative question, but I'm going to ask it. Where does that division come from? Right. So adult mental health, peer support, family partners. Do you have a sense of why there is a disconnection or where the tension has been?
It's layered. I think about it in terms of the movie Shrek. It's layered. I think partly, obviously, it's the way that our systems are designed. So we're not designed to talk to each other. So again, family partners were put in the children's system, and then adults and mental health and recovery support is in the adult system and the substance use system. So we don't really do well with each other as far as talking and like collaborating. We try different things. I think it also sometimes, it has to do with where the money is coming from, how well you can partner. At least, again, initially, it's we didn't necessarily make the effort to partner better, right? I think that's the gist, is that we could have done better with partnering. But I also think that now we're looking at it, you know, there's like somebody else said earlier, there's always been bickering about like, well, my lived experience is this, and mine is this, and yours is this. And so we kind of siloed each other based on that. And we're like, okay, we want to acknowledge, you're right, they're all different. Nobody can live your life but you. That's why I say you got a PhD in your lived experience, and everybody has their own PhD. But now thinking broader in the bigger context is how can just we work together? But there have been just the way that our systems are set up and designed. Initially, it wasn't designed for wanting family voice. When they started putting things in the grants that you have to have family participation, it became like a checkbox, right? So you just, oh, wait, let me call, oh, we got a meeting tomorrow. Let me call this family so they can get them to participate in this meeting so we can say we checked it off. So there's lots of things that I think that, again, it's layered. But I think now that we're understanding it, it's like, okay, now we have the intentionality to do better. Like now that we know, now I know who my peers are and I know who my recovery support specialists are. We have calls with people. We want to get out and meet. We're doing site visits so we can see who everybody is. And how do we, again, work together so that we're not so siloed and that we can't say, well, I don't know who they are. I don't know where they're located. We want to do a better job of that.
Wonderful. Okay, I see Noah's hand up, and I think there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. So Noah?
Yeah, I just want to say this real briefly. I can say for myself, like I had a terrible time with my family and my own recovery. I think that is a big piece. Is I think for a lot of us, I don't know that our families have always been like a source of support, and that can be like a pretty common thing. I think also in the mental health system in particular, you can feel like you as the person kind of most impacted, your voice can be discarded for your family's voice at times. I think that's another piece. I can say that it's been a big learning process for me as I've gotten to learn and understand the role of that the family partners play. I think that's another thing, is we don't understand each other's roles very well. And and this role work much more with families than I ever did when I was practicing, have seen that our families' voices are disregarded the same way our voices are disregarded, and the challenges of our systems and navigation, that like how valuable that support is. So I think some of it has to do with personal experiences with our own families, a lot of times, and bringing that into our relationship with what family partner means. So it like replays this dynamic that might not have been healthy. And the other is just not a familiarity of what the role is and the struggles that families have in our systems.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting. And I relate to that, Noah. My family was actually the source of a lot of my trauma and my pain. And I had to, in doing all of this work in the peer movement, recognize and value the role of family partners, and that it's not about, but I also hear you say, we can't replace one voice for another, because it's not the same voice. We want to honor the family voice, and the person that's experiencing it directly themselves may want different things. They're just different experiences, different perspectives, and we want to find a space for all of those, but not replace one voice with another. Anna also said that it grew out of different backgrounds, different movements, different understandings of recovery, the relationships with clinical systems, and that many of these differences have led to differences in opinions. And what we do as peer supporters may have showed up very differently. But it sounds like it's really evolving in Texas, and you all have the desire, the intention, the vision to come together and recognize that there is a space for everybody in somebody's well-being and recovery. And we actually have more in common than we have differences. And so we have to be able to honor and uplift each other. So that being said, Felicia, oh yeah.
Yeah, I wanted
Yes,
to
go
add
ahead.
that really quick. I want to say I've had the opportunity to have multiple conversations, vulnerable conversations with peer support specialists around this. Like, I really want to know, like, what is it? And I hear, right, that some people did not have the best relationship with their families, or their families were not they didn't feel at the time, or maybe ever, were the best supporters for them. I think what I'll say to that is something that as family partners, and just to be frank, I've also heard a lot in those conversations, our families are trying to control us. And I hear that. And I think that that's what, for me, that is the friction between adult peers and family partners. The adult peers want to limit the control that families have. And I hear that, and I understand that, and I have definitely seen that. I've also seen a young person, a 17-year-old, in a chronic psychotic state, and parents don't know what to do, and they have to take control of that situation. So I think that, and like I said earlier, as the guardian of my brother and as a parent, that's our one job, is to keep that person, that young person, alive. And forgive me for being vulnerable here, but that's really what we're trying to do as parents. I know everyone had a different experience. I often joke, in 2 or 3 years, my son will be like, "Oh, I'm seeing my therapist to talk about how awful you were to me." It's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. But I hope that what part of this conversation is that for adult peers to understand that as family partners, we're here about the family voice and helping families understand how to bring their youth voice into that. We're not here to control every aspect of youth, but to help guide, but to also help families understand your youth, what they want to do and how they want to live their life is what the goal is what's important. And like Felicia said, kids can't vote. And a lot of times families are too busy to vote or to do all the advocacy that they need to do. They need support in doing that. So just so that y'all know, and I did family partner training for a couple of years, and this is something that we talk about all the time. We're not here to control families or youth. We're here to help people have that voice, but also understand that their youth will transition. They will grow up, and we need to focus on what their goals are and how they want to live their life. And that is something that as family partners, we train and we teach and we support around. And that is something that we hope that adult peers understand.
Okay, if the dialogue hasn't already begun in your community, it's starting here. And it sounds like this is a rich dialogue to continue. Very complicated. Thank you, Felicia. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Nydia. We appreciate you so much. You're going to stick around. We're going to have opportunities for Q&A at the end as well, and more open dialogue. So please keep that in mind and formulate any questions that you have. All right, for our last group of panelists, we have Dorothy, we have Joe, we have Maureen, and they are here to talk about substance use, peer recovery, coaching. So given that, please introduce yourselves, and I'm going to kick it off to you all.
All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Powell, and I'm a young person, a young Black man in long-term recovery. And what that means is, for me, I haven't had a drink in 35 years and haven't used any opiates since January of 1973. And it's only because of long-term recovery that I'm able to be the president and CEO of APA, the Association of Persons Affected by Addiction, here in Dallas, Texas. And in Texas for 25 years now. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dorothy West. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Recovery and Wellness Resources, and I am glad to be here with so many giants in this field. So glad to be here.
I'm Maureen Nichols. I'm the Associate Director of Programs for the Addiction Research Institute here at UT Austin. And I have had the privilege to be an ally and to continually grow and learn more and more about the peer recovery and certified family partner movement in Texas since about 2013.
All right. And I'm just going to kick it off just to connect the dots to where our advocates before us just left off, and we are just honored and thank you everyone for being here. Wow, Shireen is here from North Carolina helping us out. This is really cool. But our purpose, for me, again, as a person in long term, going way back, y'all mentioned the civil rights movement, of course. I was around then in New York and Harlem, New York. But to bring it up to where we are today, one of the things that I learned first, as far as in the peer movement, was that our purpose is to spread recovery. Our purpose is to spread health, wellness, and recovery in every way we can. And so with support, and I think that for us, being that we are recovery support, we provide recovery support services, we are recovery support peer specialists. It's all about how do I support you, right, in a healthy way, right? And it's not easy. We say that it's a simple, I know with the program that I come from, we say it's a simple program for complicated minds. But for us, it's for complicated systems, for complicated communities, complicated people sometimes. So, but how do we really connect and spread recovery? So our stories must be told. I want to just start off with that because our history is so important. We're standing on the shoulders of so many that came before. And y'all went back to the civil rights movement. And so when we talk about that, how important that was, for how did, bring in March on Washington, how did all of those people come together, and Martin Luther King and all of those leaders do that? And I think for us, that's what this is about. I always say that joining is healing and separateness is sickness. So anytime we separate ourselves, right, that is it can be very unhealthy for us. But the learning that we have to have from our history and our cultures, and especially the people that we serve, how do we really serve and really be culturally considerate of other people, especially if you're providing peer support? That is so crucial when you're talking about multiple paths of recovery, the many paths. So it's very important that for me to at least to say that, to get it started with, because of all that which y'all said, I was just getting so much out of that. My spirit was like going through all kinds of lights is coming on within me. So, but I want to make sure that I say that. And I'm gonna pass it on to Maureen here. I think she's gonna start us off, because she's gonna go back to some early time too.
Sure. So one of the pieces that we talked about when Dorothy and Joe and I got together, that sort of indirectly led to some of the peer work is in the early 90s, in 1992, Governor Richard and Lieutenant Governor Bob Bullock, and at the time championed, and the legislature passed legislation to fund the Criminal Justice Initiative, which provided several thousand beds in the prison system for what was substance use treatment services while people were incarcerated. And then once they were released, it provided 3 months of residential substance use services for individuals in their home community, along with a year of outpatient. And some of the early graduates of that, including Dylan West and others, and Dorothy, you probably remember the names of some of the other folks, founded a Texas chapter of the Winner's Circle, which was a peer support organization for individuals that were justice involved and in recovery. And so that was one thread, and you and Dylan, developed then your community peer recovery organization, and have been doing that work ever since in Houston. So I'm going to turn it over to you a little bit as well.
Okay. Well, yeah, Dylan was not the founder, but when he got out of prison, he actually joined the Forces of Winter Circle and was the chairman for over 10 years with them. So the founders of Winter Circle were Raymond Davis and Simon Bartise. So just to set that
the name. I'm going to write those in the chat so that so Jesse can get them in the record.
Okay. So yeah, and I'm coming into the history, really late in the game. I am a recipient of the services that people had already put together of peer support. Obviously, I am a person in long-term recovery, a young woman in long-term recovery. Therefore, it's been over 20 years since I've had a drink or a drug, and I kind of started out in the clinical department, and then there was a lot of buzz around peer support. And so the organization I was working for at that time kind of like, hey, you should go to this class. That was the Recovery Coach Academy that Dylan was teaching at that time around 2010. So coming into this initiative in 2010, obviously, there has been so much work done in peer support, but yet it was still at a time for me that I got to, kind of like be the fly on the wall, always meeting Joe in some city, or, the Robin Paysons and the, Michael Ann Hurst. These are and Ben Bass out of El Paso. So these were my mentors. So a lot of work had already been done that set the pace for me and my growth in peer support. So so Houston kind of like tailed along, and we used other RCOs to, be mentored and loved upon to continue this work. I sat at the table with multiple people when we were just talking about having a rally, Texas Recovers, and they were just now beginning to, how do we celebrate recovery? How do we, utilize our voices and let them know that we can, will, and do recover? So that's how I kind of got a chance to be a part of how we started celebrating recovery. I pulled in all the youth, and because I figure I had like the fun part, because we were cheerleaders. I had little kids cheering for recovery at the Capitol, just totally on fire, which I hope and pray that that energy returns back into this field, because again, I am in agreement with the movement, the watered down type of peer support that is maybe circulating. But yet I still think the peer movement is fairly strong. So I'm gonna turn it back to you, Joe, because you have some of the real nuts and bolts of what was going on at that time.
Yes, yes, yes. And I appreciate you and Maureen actually going all the way back to 92 because, a lot of people don't know that I think I started at the Salvation Army, right? After I got sober in 1988, right? And I ended up working at the Salvation Army, $5 an hour. Giving out towels to the homeless that came upstairs on the second floor at the Salvation Army. Ended up downstairs because they ended up with a state grant, the Salvation Army, to do treatment and detox at the Salvation Army. And I ended up down there because my sponsor said, "Hey, you're gonna be a counselor. Go back to school." And I went to Eastfield College, and I ended up taking the test. Finishing up and taking the test in 1990, the 𝐏𝐫𝐞, and 𝐏𝐫𝐞 was before LCDC. They was called a Certified Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counselor. And so, and that really started it for me. But the place where you and Maureen talked about, as far as the criminal justice and the TTC, I ended up going out to Wilma, and we opened up the first substance abuse treatment felony program out there, the Safe P, what we call it, right? In Wilma, Texas in 1990. And when we opened it was called Interventions from Chicago. But anyway, coming up this way, just to mention that, because Ann Richards, of course, the governor who was in recovery, everybody knew she was loud about her recovery, and it was great to be there at that era. But a lot was going on. I also, of course, was on the mental health side too. And that leads as I come up because of my own family, with, of course, with serious mental health challenges throughout the family, 7 brothers and 1 sister. And I always say that I have, for sure, PTSD, as well as some others, PTSS, etc. That's some history there that y'all might have to learn about too. But yeah, definitely, Dorothy, coming up to 1998, and I'm gonna go ahead and come with SAMHSA, of course. So me and there's a lot of people in the recovery community that was really brought together. I know in Dallas, the way we did it, and there was an organization called Dallas Helps, and it was one of the Department of State Health Services contractors and agencies, and they're the ones that actually came to the recovery community and said, hey, you know, that the federal government, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is getting ready to put out its first recovery grant. And so, and what we had found out from that history there is that Dr. Clark, Bill White, and Dr. Clark, of course, with the center, he was the director for Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, one of the 3 agencies under SAMHSA, right? Because they have prevention, treatment, and mental health, Center for Mental Health Service. So with Dr. Clark, he looked at the data because when he took over SAMHSA, CSAT, he saw that only 10% of the United States was going to treatment for addiction. So he said, wow, only 10%. That's not a lot. And guess what, folks? In the state of Texas, how many of you think is even going, getting help or getting the treatment? It's less than that. You know, I talked to Cynthia Humphrey not too long ago, who was over the Center for Substance Abuse Programs here in Texas. But back then, 25 years ago, Dr. Clark saw that only 10% of the country was getting at least attempting to get treatment for recovery, you know, because most of the people do not seek treatment. Anyway, and that's when they decided, okay, people do recover, he said. I know people because he's from Detroit. And so he said, why don't we bring people in recovery from addictions? Now, the mental health had already started, and you heard all of our advocate peers earlier to talk about that and how that movement, because that movement goes way back, you know what I mean, even with the disabilities movement also, and all of that, the different movement when it comes to advocacy. But anyway, that's when Dr. Clark and the SAMHSA put out the first recovery, the RSP, what is it?
RFP.
Yeah, request for proposals. So those proposals went out in '98, and APA was one of the, of course, was the first in Texas. I think Bill, along with Ben Bass, his group also applied, and they also received a grant too, I believe, in '98. So both of us in Texas really was started this, at least in Texas, the first peer recovery organizations. Bill White again, and you know, 𝐸𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐻𝑆 Achara. A lot of y'all know 𝐸𝐿𝐼𝐻𝐻𝑆 Achara. Do you know she goes all the way back to to that era too, and she was helping out. Of course, because then all over the country, when we had even Connecticut was one where Ron Kirk, the commissioner there, his name was Tom Kirk. He actually changed the whole behavioral health system to a recovery-oriented system of care. That's when we first heard recovery-oriented system care for on the behavioral health side for a whole state to do that. And so the recovery movement started, you know, I mean, and we had to go back and forth to Washington, D.C. to really move forward with advocacy. Now, the first 4 years, that first grant, that we had, that was for advocacy. It wasn't for peer recovery. We hadn't started recovery support services yet. It was all advocacy. So all of us had to go to legislators, you know what I mean, get with people like Jason Howell and all the other folks and see how do we really be, you know, educate the community? How do we educate our legislators? How do we really get the word out about recovery? And so, because a lot of people still today don't even know what recovery means. And that right there really started in that first 3 years, 2001. That's when we had the first recovery summit, and that summit in St. Paul, Minnesota. We about 200 of us came together, and in there, that's when we also and Senator Paul Wellstone from Minnesota. He was actually our advocate and leaders at that time. That was at the summit, and so. But anyway, a lot of y'all know about what happened to his family, and you know, may they rest in peace. But so we actually Faces and Voices of Recovery. That's when we formed Faces and Voices of Recovery, and I was on the board for the first 10 years at Faces and Voices of Recovery. But that was where we did a lot of the work as far as really starting the addiction recovery movement in the United States. So again, all over the country. And so with that, I think, let's see, I think I want to pass it on there. Is there anyone who was that? Who was that? Maureen, did you want to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We didn't do a really good job on the planning the transitions, y'all. We just talked a lot together. So, did you want to talk a little bit about brass tacks, Joe? Because you were involved in that. The state of Texas, Department of Health Services, State Health Services at the time got funding to receive bringing recovery support services to, I forget what, bringing recovery support services to scale. Thank you. I knew I was almost there. And received funding to do that as a state, and a group of you went up and received training through SAMHSA to really do some of this recovery transformation work here in Texas. So I know you were, this was right, I started being involved right after this event here. So I thought, since you were there, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, definitely, yeah. We all went to Washington, D.C. and really to represent the state of Texas here for brass tacks, bringing recovery support services to scale, right? How do we really take it to scale with technical assistance centers, right? And that's what brass tacks stand for. And y'all see the advocates right here in front of us, right? I mean, we couldn't do the history without this picture here. I said, well, everybody needs to see this right here, all the way from Wendy, of course. Now, Sam Shore, you heard his name mentioned earlier with the mental health, and I believe Shannon or one of y'all, Amy, mentioned Sam Shore, of course, and he goes way back with the state of Texas Department of State Health Services, and he also was part of that grant. And when they're talking about it, really putting peer services even on the mental health side before the addiction side, before 98, right? And so Sam is still around doing a lot of other work as far as recovery oriented systems of care around the country. And so I'm not, I forgot the ladies' names, all of them, but I know that they work for Sam. So right here, also next to Sam, I'm not familiar with the lady with the gray hair and the glasses. And if somebody know her name.
Dina Stoner.
What is it? What's her name?
Dina Stoner, I believe.
That's Nita Sterner. Okay. And then
Dina Stoner. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And next to Nina, you got Lauren, and you got Laura. So you got Lauren Lewis, and then you got Laura Munch, and then the lady behind Laura Munch, I'm not sure. And I called Philander this morning. Some of y'all might know Philander Moore right there in the front down there next to me. He who worked with the state, and we couldn't have done this without his energy, without his spirit, right? Without his leadership that he had at that time. He did a lot of work with Dave Wanzer and all of with the state to really to push recovery support services and to push the recovery movement. Okay. Also, you have back there Drew Brooks, who was a pastor of the faith movement, and he came with us, and Sherry Jackson, Leonard Kincaid, and then you see Cynthia Humphrey right behind me, right, who is still today over the Center for Substance Abuse Programs, right? But this is the movement right here that actually we even, after this happened, of course, with Philander, and of course, when we took Terracos. And Terracos was an organization that we formed with recovery community organizations, like y'all mentioned earlier, with Michael Ann Hurst, right, Ben Bass, and myself and Dylan West, and we went into Philander in the group and said, hey, what about peer recovery training? So when we're talking about recovery peer specialist training, which we had already created some trainings, but it wasn't nothing like what we have today. CCAR in Connecticut was the first one to actually start charging, out of the group, out of all of us in 98 that came together, and they started charging for peer specialist training. And but yeah, this right here group here is a great group that actually go back to 2012. Here's the Hogg Foundation. When you mentioned the Hogg Foundation earlier, and some of y'all might remember Stephanie, and Stephanie is right there behind me, and she passed last year, I believe. She was a peer, great peer, and great friend of ours. And did a lot of work. We actually had a grant with them called ART, A-R-T, which stands for Advancing Recovery in Texas, with the Hogg Foundation. And next to Stephanie, of course, is Dr. King Davis. And King Davis also became, of course, the first African American to actually be the executive director for the Hogg Foundation. And a good friend of mine going way back with him. And of course, you've got Anna right next to her, who did all of the work as our worker person right there. Anna, she did all of it, bringing us together and doing it. And she would come to your organization and do a lot of great work as far as the support. How do we support the community moving forward? This one here is just pretty much some national advocates here. The only reason why I'm showing this too for y'all is that Don Coyes, right there to the left with the gray hair, the older guy. And Don, of course, is the executive director and founder of the White Bison. And the White Bison, of course, is the Red Road of Recovery, right? And Don started that. And he was one of the cohorts, also the RCSPs that came together at the beginning with all of us in '98. And then you have Andre Johnson in the back, Tom Hill, who also came with us in '98. And then Donna right there, Donna is still on the recovery department today for SAMHSA. SAMHSA today just created a recovery department with Paolo Del Vecchio as the chair, and Donna is on that right there. But what I wanted to say about when you talk about culturally congruent, so how do the peer specialists really support, right, someone of Native, right? It's a Native American, right? And so, and I want to have I want to follow my Native elders' way, path of recovery, right? And do we know how that recovery coach or peer specialist, right, would connect and support them? But Dawn actually got up at the board meeting. We were sitting in a Faces and Voices of Recovery board meeting, and Dawn got up and said, you know what, Joe, this ain't getting it for me and my people. And he left. And that's when he left Facing Voice of Recovery, the board, and actually went on and really blew up with the White Bison, right? And the Wellbriety movement. From that, he started the Wellbriety movement, right? And so, great man right there, but it taught us a lot as far as where do we go culturally, as far as culturally considered. Of course, we have here Mr. Dylan West and Dorothy West right there, right? And then and my best there too, of course, Annie Powell and myself. But Dylan, of course, did a lot of work with us to really to move this peer specialist and peer movement throughout Texas. Did a lot of work with us, and thank you, Dorothy, for that. This is I guess we hadn't got here yet, but and we can come back to that picture if you want to, right there. But Maureen and Dorothy, what do you have next?
Yeah, you were mentioning Philander Moore, and after brass tacks, and after the group went to the training, he really came back inspired by the vision of recovery, transformation, and systems. And that's when he was the director of substance use treatment at the Department of State Health Services at the time. And he worked with leadership there to find some community block grant funding to pilot some programs to both recovery community organizations, other community organizations, and some treatment programs to bring in the recovery model in substance use treatment programs, to bring into the recovery model into their systems, bring peer support services, but also really transform towards this vision that Bill White had nationally brought forth around what it means to be in long-term recovery in your natural community, and how systems can support that as opposed to sort of the acute care crisis model that had been in place for a long time. So those pilots began in 2014, and he brought in Dr. Achara to help with technical assistance around the implementation of those, what's now called the Recovery Support Services programs. A couple of years later, he and that department, the Substance Use Treatment Department at DISH, expanded some of that funding to include youth recovery community organizations and to provide youth mentors. And that has been going on as well, and now resides with the peer recovery. I don't know if you guys are a department or a division. I always get confused about that. But the current peer recovery unit at HHSC, and they oversee all of those ongoing programs. They move from pilots to being 5 years later to being fully a part of what HHSC offers as part of their substance use block grant services. And so that's been ongoing since then. Did I miss anything?
You know what? I want to put in something here as far as don't drop the mic. This is a series that I do around pass the mic. Don't drop the mic, whatever you do. And the thing is that how what you just described with Philander and this group here, and even passing it on to Noah, and the peer department and HHSC now, and the name. How do we transition? We know that recovery is contagious. We say give it to somebody, pass it on to, also in different levels. How do we do that? And that's something that I know that the group earlier, when they was talking about that same thing, we just want to continue that. So how do we support each other? So I just want to add that, because that was great what you just said, how they passing it on. Okay.
Yeah, and there was some of this reflects changes in the system and the merging of DISH into HHSC. And then I think one of the other pieces that on the substance use side that has really grown recovery support in a variety of different ways is the national funding that started to come down around 2017 to address the opioid crisis. The states were granted, year by year, a significant sum of money, and Texas really invested on the substance use side in expanding recovery support services in a variety of settings. And so that, and what they call TTOR in Texas, the Texas opioid response, targeted opioid response, offered up an opportunity for other models to come into play where recovery support are provided, whether that's in emergency rooms or with, I believe they have programs in family planning clinics. They have the recovery homes. The recovery housing component has really grown as well in that regard, in that sense. Some funding with those projects as well. So that's been another area where there's been rapid growth, I think, because of that piece. And for better or worse, how that money rolls out and how that's shaped also has sort of shaped the last 5 or 6 years. And then, of course, and there are people on here from HHSC that can talk about this in far more depth than I can. But so I'll just start it off, and if anyone wants to join in, the development where the legislature passed a law that allowed for the funding of peer recovery support services through their state Medicaid plan. And then the advisory group that came together around that to really bring the voices of the people doing the work and the voices of people in the community to advise the state on how to set that funding up. And that's really sort of been the next, I think you talk about passing the torch or maybe opening the doors wider. That's really been the next big expansion since 2019 is the and then of course as HHSC DISH moved into HHSC, the decision by the HHSC to develop a peer support division unit, whatever technical term you are, a group of people within that state agency to really lead, and that is where Noah and his team have picked up the mantle and moved things forward since 2019. So an amazing sort of array of people involved in all that.
Yeah.
So Maureen, as we're transitioning into questions, and Joe, these pictures, it just brings the history to life, and the people that have been in Texas for such a long time, paving the way to make even today possible, making it possible for those of us with lived experience to have a career and turn our wounds into wisdom. These are the people that have allowed that to happen in Texas, but also around the country. So as we transition into questions in the last few minutes that we have, since you ended on Medicaid, I have just a general question. This is for everybody. So for our family partners, our mental health peer supporters, our substance use recovery coaches and recovery peer community, how has Medicaid billing for peer support shaped, influenced, changed, enhanced, or challenged peer support in Texas? What's the impact that Medicaid has had on peer support in Texas? And what is the vision as you all move forward?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that most of us, unless you making some money, I mean, how is Medicaid really influencing and making an impact on us? Again, we are billable. That's a huge advocacy step. It took all of us. I mean, even all over the country, I was part of some advocacy around the country with that. But I believe with Medicaid, for years we've been trying to get Medicaid to bill peer services, and how do we do that? So yeah, I believe with House Bill 1486 it was a milestone. It was a huge milestone for us to be able to bill. My organization can do that, and again, there's that make the peer specialist even more valuable, right? When he goes to an agency, because I am an RSPS or MHPS, and now the organization that I work for can bill, right? Because I can't bill, as a person, but the organization that I work for, right? If they have a Medicaid number or that they really want, so when it comes to, and everybody know here, as far as the rates, that has probably been one of the biggest challenges as far as how is that really impacting us as an organization, as a state of Texas, and the advocacy work that has to continue, right? And so, yeah, you've got some advocates on here that can add to that. But I think that the challenges and the good stuff is there.
Yeah, I also like to add that I think it lessened the fidelity of the workforce for peers, because now a lot of organizations were seeing that as a opportunity. So it's just like anybody with just lived experience. One thing is have lived experience, but on the other hand, to have experience on the side of recovery. So just snatching up peers just to fulfill having a RSPS on site, like I said, it really lessened the fidelity of what we were taught early, the way the Philanders and Laura Chappelle's and shared the fire that they had for the fidelity of recovery support services and the recovery support specialist. It was more about the stigmas and labels and making sure that people were addressed properly and handled, and these peer specialists were also cared for, because they are people in recovery that still, like I said, early in recovery, we're still trying to, get their lives together. But yet they were offered opportunities just to fulfill the organization's need for peer specialists to build Medicaid.
And that's not a Texas thing, right? That's happening nationally. And that tension between being able to financially sustain as an organization and build a workforce and a career with the fidelity, the co-optation, and the values that the peer movement was founded upon is a tension that continues to happen all over the country. So I just want to pause just to say, we're going to go a few minutes over because we have Anna and Noah with their hands up, and then we have 2 questions in the Q&A. So if you can stay with us, please feel free to do that. This is when the dialogue gets really rich, right? So I hope you can stay with us. If you can't, that's okay too. We really appreciate you being a part of this. And for those of you that need to dip out, we will see you on Monday. All right. But I think, Anna, your hand was up first. So do you have a question, or do you have something else that you wanted to add?
No, yeah, something else I wanted to add in response to your question, because I was on the work group and, and advocated for us to be Medicaid billable. One of the things that I think is a challenge is that we work under a fallacy that having our services be billable is going to equal better pay, and that is not true. And even though we've increased the reimbursement rate, we haven't necessarily seen a correlated increase in pay. And so that, being able to fund our services was one of the big impetuses behind being Medicaid billable. I think that one of the things that we got out of that is now we look more like the system. we keep taking on the trappings of the very system we say we are not part of. And it's one of my concerns is a push that I see among peer-run programs to become organizations that can bill Medicaid, which is, in my view, a complete violation of our ethics, because by definition, Medicaid is a medical insurance that requires medical necessity for the service that's being provided. And for us to meet those requirements, that means having a clinician on staff, which by definition is not what a peer-run program does. The other thing is, I think that we lose sight of the complexity of what Medicaid is. And I don't know any organization right now that would have the funds to be able to implement what they would have to implement to be able to bill Medicaid, because of the infrastructure, the need for reporting to the state, the need for reporting to the federal government, the fact that if 10 years after the fact they decide that something they paid for is no longer eligible, they can come back and say, pay back $10 million because, you know, over the last 10 years you billed for something that's no longer allowable. We don't talk about those things when we talk about being Medicaid billable. So I think this is a very slippery slope that we need to be better informed about.
What do you gain and what do you give up? There's always something to gain, and there's always something that ends up being compromised or being lost in the exchange. So did you want to respond to Anna? Did you have something that you want to say?
Who?
Joe?
No. I'm waiting.
Okay.
No.
So Anna, real quick then, you were an advocate for Medicaid billing peer support. If you had to go back and do it differently, would you change that? Or would you change the way in which advocacy was done for peer support?
I would change where we were doing the advocacy. I think we need to do more advocacy with the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare and talk about recovery not being a medical necessity, but actually being a life-saving option that people can voluntarily choose to step into. And how can we create, if we're going to be able to get, unfortunately, the way medicine is done, we're stuck under medicine. We're not a medical system. That's one of the things. The other is, if there is a payer that benefits because we do good services, let's have them match what we need to pay for our services and pay for them at a competitive rate, and not have to fit their model in order to draw down their money. And so I would say our advocacy needs to be a different kind of advocacy at a different level.
And it sounds like some labor issues in terms of equitable pay is also a part of that advocacy, perhaps. Okay, Noah, what you have?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easy to forget what the landscape was like and why we were advocating for what we were advocating for in 1486, which I don't remember funding really being the main focus of our advocacy. Like, the things that I had written down and the things that we focused on as a work group was, one, we were having a lot of one was requiring lived experience. We were beginning to see peer specialists being certified and defined as peer specialists that did not have lived experience. So I remember that was like one of the first things. The next thing was creating a path for peer specialists to supervise peer specialists. That was something else. We were really seeing no opportunities for peer specialists to move into that supervision role, and we wanted that to be a path. Then the other was, we had supervisors who had no idea what the role of peer support was. So we wanted to create a requirement for anyone that supervised peer specialists, at the very least, to be trained and know what the work was, in addition to having that path for folks to be able to get into the role. The other was the way that we define lived experience. I know on the mental health side, it required a diagnosis prior to this. And on the substance use side, there was just some problematic things. And that's where, the question arose in the work group is, do we want a doctor's office to be the gatekeeper to this profession? And so having codified something that does not require a diagnosis, but requires the struggle And more important than the struggle, being able to articulate that path to where you get better. So we were able to, as a group, define it. Another piece was ensuring that the services were always recovery oriented, relationship focused, strength based, and voluntary, always person centered. Another thing that's codified into the code. So, you know, I think obviously there's a ton of things that need to be continue to be focused on, but I do think that our that initial advocacy effort, one that we can certainly build upon since then, there was a lot of pieces in there that I think today we don't remember them being the issues, because right now they're not the concerns. They're not what they, you know what I mean? Like, our concerns are different. They're very valid. And I think, you know, particularly around the funding piece, one thing that we're looking at is how do we look to different funding models that aren't those 15-minute increment pieces? Yeah. It's really, I think Medicaid is not congruent in general with but the other piece of Medicaid is there's aspects of Medicaid that are very flexible outside of the fee-for-service 15-minute increment model. And those are recommendations that people have come to us about looking at. How do you look at a recovery space? And the inherent environment of a recovery organization is therapeutic in and of itself. And so we're looking at things like, you know, how are some of them day programming built for, and how to get, you know, maybe a drop-in center or day programming designations that are peer run so that there can be different models of funding for the bundle of services. But this has been an incredible, I don't know, this is incredible to hear the wealth of knowledge today.
It's been a walk down memory lane. This nostalgia. And you know, you mentioned the issue around Medicaid. Again, this is a contemporary issue. When Medicaid started funding peer support in the early 2000s, that was a huge victory because peer support wasn't recognized as a valued and valid way for people to give and receive support. I don't think there was a lot of understanding that would potentially center us in a medical system and the impact that can ultimately have on what we wanted to be funded, which was the very authentic peer-to-peer relationships, but how that would then end up being challenged within that medicalized system. So it's like a mixed bag, right? But Medicaid itself and you know, Noah, leaders around the country are trying to figure out how do we leverage Medicaid to financially support real, authentic, fidelity-based peer-run organizations, as opposed to expecting them to become something that Medicaid feels more comfortable with, which is then looking like the traditional system. So again, that's not a Texas only issue. That's something that is happening all over the country. You just happen to be in the middle of those conversations. So I think Felicia's hand was up and Jason's hand was up.
Sure. I just wanted to say, because you asked the question for each particular kind of certification area. And so for the family partners, when it comes to 1489, nothing has changed for us because we're not included in that at all. Right. Which is why I keep saying one bad, one sound, because when there's division, other things happen. So now what is happening up the pipeline is that family partners is kind of going through the pipeline, the Medicaid pipeline, to get its own Medicaid benefit. Now, I think like what everybody is saying, there's intended and then there's unintended consequences when things like that happen. We don't know all the unintended consequences because it hasn't been approved. It hasn't, you know, gone out yet. So we're still kind of in the holding pattern. But some of the things that we can see is, one, we don't want to be divided. That's one thing. Like if we're going to have a peer benefit, we would love to have had just everybody use the same code, the same everything, the same structure. It makes it a lot easier, a lot cleaner. But it's okay if we do. We just have to learn how to kind of provide that education around the benefit. And I think that's what we're learning too, is how do we provide a better education and clarity around things like Medicaid? Because again, there's unintended consequences that are behind the scenes that unfortunately, sometimes we don't know until we get stung, right? Like you see the bee, but you don't know what's going to sting you. So you have to be, but you're mindful that the bee is there, right? And so you do the best that you can to protect yourself from the bee, but occasionally you'll still get stung. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. But again, on the family partner side, it didn't necessarily do anything for us because we can't use that billing code. However, it still highlighted the importance of peers and why it's needed and why we need to continue, just like everybody else said, is looking at different strategies. Medicaid is one strategy for billing. And I always like to say, don't ever depend on state money. Don't ever, just don't do it. Again, we're one avenue. And so again, our job is to figure out ways to look at different strategies, like Shannon said earlier, diversify your portfolios, and then whatever we can do to help support that. So if that's providing training, if that's getting technical assistance to help peer-run organizations. Right now, we have Texas Family Voice as a family peer-run organization. There's other family organizations out there. They're not technically what we would say all peer-run, but they have a lot of peerness in their organization. And so we want to make sure that we're also including those in the conversation, not just for this particular, the POGA, which is, we're grateful because we have one, because that's also often gets left out of the conversations when we're talking about peer-run organizations as well. So we want to make sure that we just expand and inform people as much as possible, because again, I think like everybody's saying, there are an intended and then unintended consequences of everything that we do. I think we can be transparent about that, and then we can also create strategies on how to make that a little less damaging.
That's right. So second hop on conversation, right? The first one was the connection between family partners and adult mental health peer specialists, and where that division has occurred, and where there's alignment, and how do we start having those dialogues. Second one is what you're saying, lessons learned from Medicaid funding peer support, lessons learned for family partners that haven't gotten the benefit of that, but also haven't been had to deal with some of the challenges that Medicaid has brought into the peer community as well. So it sounds like there's a lot of conversations to be had about Medicaid and peer support. Now, Jason, before you get off mute, I want to recognize and honor something you said in the chat much earlier, which is in the mental health peer support community, mental health historically has been fighting against oppression, because oftentimes mental health systems can be experienced as oppressive. In the substance use peer community, it's a history of neglect, and you're stinking thinking and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and you know, this is a moral failing, and there's a lot of systemic neglect that has happened in the substance use. So we're both fighting social justice, just in different avenues. So I appreciate you highlighting that, and I just wanted to bring that to everybody's attention if you haven't been able to go back and read the chat. So that being said, Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for lifting that up. My comment was that the gift of 1486 was that we have a peer and recovery department positioned right underneath Deputy Executive Commissioner Gaines. If we roll back prior to that, we did have some champions on the inside of Health and Human Services, like Philander Moore, but they were constantly hitting ceilings and really couldn't get a lot of things passed through. We now have so much more influence and reach and accessibility to Health and Human Services than we ever have before. I was around when we were passing 1486, and we knew it was never going to be the money tree for RCOs, but it has been. We have received a lot of benefit from it.
All right, so keeping with the theme of RCOs and substance use peer support, there's a question in the Q&A, and it is regarding the watering down of peer support. How do you think, or do you think, that the substance use peer recovery movement has been watered down by shifting more toward harm reduction? It's a provocative question, but has a shift toward harm reduction away from abstinence influenced or watered down the peer recovery movement in the substance use community? Open to anybody.
It depends on what, you know, when you say harm reduction, first of all, knowing what harm reduction are you talking about? Because I know with Dr. Clark and in the meetings that we've had at SAMHSA, right, then it was like harm reduction has its own category. You know, now if you put it in, yeah, I mean, it will dilute anything you put in. That's one of the Bill White's warnings to us 20 years ago. It's about the dilution and how that, you know, you're going to water down in many different ways. So I think with harm reduction itself, right, depends on how you're looking at it. If you're looking at it through opiates, you know what I mean, as far as Matt and Mars, as far as naltrexone, right, you know what I mean? So there's similar harm reduction there in the opiate arena. But it depends on what you say. But it can dilute. I think because of the fidelity is so important to peer support, though, for us to keep that. And then also, how do we really move peer support, knowing what that is, into communities? For me in the Black community, right? I mean, that's one of my focuses right now, the social determinants of health in the Black community, which is unserved and is still going through same civil rights stuff that we have in just in the community. So anyway, so harm reduction, what I'm doing, right, is kind of separate because you know, you can look at all of it as harm reduction when it comes to, you know what I mean, overdosing and killing ourselves, and then even, but mental health is a little bit different. So when you look at harm reduction.
So Jason responded, harm reduction and recovery are two important but separate philosophical approaches to address substance use issues. The conflation hurts both the harm reduction and the recovery movements and fidelity. Other thoughts? When harm reduction was, I mean, harm reduction has been around forever. It's not new. But when it was really introduced into the landscape of substance use, did it water down peer support? Did it enrich it? What happened in Texas?
So
Loaded question.
I raised my hand just because I'm not embedded in that system, and from the outside looking in, what I saw was that it caused cognitive dissonance for all of the peers who were recovery coaches, because they grew up in one system and they were being asked to do another. But what it also, I think, caused was to take on the idea of recovery from a higher point of view. And this is something Joe and I've talked about a lot, is talking about what is your life going to look like moving forward, not what is defining it from behind, and looking at the umbrella idea of trauma, and either approach, whether it be mental health or substance use, is to deal with the things that have happened to us in our lives. And so I think it's kind of forced that greater conversation. I think it has also impacted, and I saw it in the new core curriculum, having a level set for what we say peer support is in Texas. And that sense of it being voluntary and being what the person says they want it to be. And some may say they want abstinence, others may say they want reduction, and being able to live with both worldviews to address what the person is saying they want.
There's another question in the chat for family partners, and that is, currently family partners are really centered in the youth mental health system. Do you ever see in Texas an emergence towards family support in the adult mental health system? Have there been any conversations in Texas about that?
We want family support for the lifespan, just like everything else. And that's what we're working towards, because we do agree. It's like kids grow up. I mean, they're not going to stay 0 to 17 their whole life. My daughter is 21. She gave me the gift of my job, but she is fully an adult living her best life. But I am still in the backseat. I tell people we just changed drivers, right? Now she's driving, and she is the leader of the car, but I'm still a passenger in the car because she wants me to be there. And so that's what we say. And I think we have to help parents navigate those systems. And a lot of it, you know, it's helping find parent voice, but it's also helping to teach parents some skills that they may not have known that they have, right? And so it's one, validating some of the strengths that they have, but it's also going, okay, let me help you add some more tools to the toolbox, because there's some stuff that, again, like we've heard before, sometimes parents can be the barriers to recovery. So we don't want that to happen. So we want to, like, different language. Let's talk about language. Let's talk about that. So this is stuff that we talk to with families. So we want that from birth all the way to literally, what did they say? There used to be a saying that from the birth to the grave, or something
From
like
the
that.
womb to the grave or something?
Yeah, from the womb to the grave. Yeah, it was something like that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But we want to be able to offer that. And that's really what we're working towards. And so we're trying to find different modalities right now through the first episode psychosis program. We're working with families of adults as well through that program. But again, we want it throughout the whole, what we call the service array, to where it doesn't matter if you come in, you may come in the children's door, but again, we want to be able to offer the services to anybody. That is our goal. That's what we're working towards. And again, So we're excited about the possibilities that can happen. I think, again, we want to see the dream team. So when we do get those families that may need that, that may identify and say, you know what, Felicia, I got some my own mental health stuff. So we can tag team our mental health peer specialist. Boom, tag, you're it for that piece. We're still going to do the family piece, but you can do be the peer specialist for that. And then same thing with the substance use. We want to be able to tag individuals because we are a team and have that team approach to make sure that we're providing the best needs for the whole entire family.
Okay, Nydia, did you want to add?
I was just gonna say, there were 2 questions, I think, from Amy Pierce, and I did answer that first question. I had just put it in the other one, so I just copy and pasted, but it was basically what Felicia said. It is for the lifespan, shocker, kids grow up. So we still, as family partners, like I mentioned, like Ed said earlier, we help prepare families for that transition piece. And like Felicia just said, doing that for the continuum, and talking about the CFPs in coordinated specialty care, or in first episode psychosis. We just in system of care, our current grant, this grant funds both MHPS for students or youth and a family partner that are embedded in a school team. And the question has come up, okay, what about after they turn 18? Like, what do we do with that? So it is available, but there are still some, like we're talking about now, it's some just logistical things with Medicaid, and they're over 18. Can they still be served, or where can they be served? That we are continually challenged by, and continually have conversations working that out. But Starbucks and donut shops and Walmarts, libraries, wherever family partners need to be, wherever families are, is something that we really, especially through this current system of care grant, is something that we're really trying to show is helpful for families and their youth.
Well, I want to take this moment to say thank you all. While Texas continues to evolve around peer support, we have all been a part of a historical moment. First of all, bringing all these folks together who are part of the history, who can share that history. And as you said, Joe, to pass the mic along, right? We're not ready for you to pass your mic along quite yet, but we get the point. But also to have people from all different sectors of peer support coming together. Next time around, we're going to have youth peer support, because it's going to be so strong in Texas that there is going to be no doubt a presence and an influence of youth mentors and youth peer support in Texas. So an aspirational idea that I'm going to throw out there. So please come back with us again, share your thoughts, ask your questions, bring your wisdom to the table, because this has been an amazing experience. As an outsider from Texas, I appreciate you all so much. Anything, Jesse and Julie, you want to say as parting words?
I'm just so excited that we have all of these true trailblazers coming together and really being able to have this conversation in what feels like a transparent way. And I'm just happy to sit here and be able to witness it.